I still remember the smell of those orchards in autumn. Crisp Honeycrisps, tart Granny Smiths, sweet Galas. 3 generations of Hargrove sweat built that legacy. $8 million worth of prime Michigan apple country. My father's land, my land, until it wasn't. The day my daughter Caroline handed me that half-eaten apple core, her eyes cold as January frost, I knew something had changed between us forever. "That's your share," she said. "After what you did to Mom, you're lucky to get anything." I never thought my own flesh and blood would betray me like this. The orchard wasn't just land, it was our family's soul. My grandfather planted those first saplings during the Depression. I spent 50 years nurturing those trees, watching them bear fruit through drought and storm. 50 years of calloused hands and sunburnt neck, of pre-dawn harvests and midnight frost warnings. Caroline sold it all behind my back. Legally, she had every right. I'd signed over power of attorney during my heart surgery. But rights and righteousness aren't the same thing. What she didn't know was that I had my own secrets about that orchard. Secrets that would change everything she thought she knew about our family. The Hargrove apple business wasn't just any farm. It was the cornerstone of Pike County. My father, Elmer Hargrove, started with 20 acres in 1945 after returning from the Pacific. A tough man, formed by the Great Depression and hardened by war, he believed discipline was the only path to success. "Trees need pruning to bear fruit, and so do boys," he'd say before taking his belt off. My mother Martha was gentler, but ultimately deferred to him. She'd slip me extra biscuits with apple butter when he wasn't looking, whispering that tomorrow would be easier. It rarely was. In our rural Michigan community, this type of upbringing wasn't unusual. Men raised sons with firm hands, preparing them for a life of physical labor and resilience against unpredictable harvests. When I was 12, I accidentally knocked over a crate of prize McIntosh apples set aside for the county fair. Dad made me kneel on those bruised apples for hours while he entertained the banker who was considering our loan application. "This is how we teach responsibility in the Hargrove family," he announced proudly, as if my humiliation was a selling point. The banker nodded approvingly. This was the 1970s in rural America, where such discipline was considered character building. By 16, I was working the orchard full-time, missing school during harvest season. I remember watching my classmates head to football games while I sorted apples in the packing shed. One autumn Saturday, some boys from school drove by, throwing rotting apples at me, shouting, "Apple boy, apple boy." Dad witnessed the whole thing, but simply said, "If you're not getting mocked, you're not working hard enough." Despite it all, I loved those trees. Each had a personality, a rhythm. I knew which ones bloomed earliest, which needed extra care during dry spells. I expanded our varieties, introduced organic sections before it was fashionable. When Dad died in 1992, I doubled our acreage, modernized operations, and built Hargrove orchards into the largest producer in the eastern Michigan region. My marriage to Ellen was secondary to the business. She knew it, I knew it, and eventually our daughter Caroline knew it too. Ellen wanted me to sell portions of the land for development. Prices were skyrocketing in the early 2000s, but I refused. "This land stays whole," I'd insist during our arguments. "It's Caroline's inheritance." The grand gesture came on our 30th anniversary. To prove my devotion, I surprised Ellen by naming the newest 50-acre section of heritage varieties Ellen's Arbor. I had a beautiful wooden sign made and arranged a ceremony with local press. I thought she'd be touched, but she merely smiled tightly for the cameras. What Ellen didn't know, what nobody knew, was that I'd mortgaged portions of the orchard twice to cover gambling debts from my secret trips to casinos in Traverse City. Those weekend agricultural conferences were actually 48-hour poker binges. I was good, usually winning enough to hide my habit, but a bad stretch in 2015 nearly cost us everything. I managed to recover before anyone noticed, but the close call terrified me. Caroline grew up watching these dynamics, a father obsessed with his land, a mother growing increasingly distant. She left for Cornell to study agricultural business, promising she'd return to help modernize our operations. I was so proud when she graduated with honors. My daughter, the first college-educated Hargrove, coming back to take our legacy to new heights. Last October marked my 67th birthday, and Caroline insisted on hosting a harvest dinner at the main farmhouse. "Dad, let me handle everything," she said. "You've earned a celebration." I was touched by her gesture, especially since things had been strained between us since Ellen's death 3 years prior. My wife never recovered from a stroke, leaving Caroline to become my primary family connection. The guest list surprised me, not just our usual crowd of local farmers and suppliers, but lawyers from Grand Rapids, an organic certification specialist, and representatives from Midwest Heritage Foods, a corporation known for acquiring family farms. When I questioned Caroline, she smiled that tight smile that reminded me so much of her mother. "Networking, Dad." That's how modern agriculture survives. The week before the party, Caroline began inventorying equipment and requesting access to financial records. "Just updating our business plan," she explained, though I noticed her spending hours on the phone in hushed conversations. I found her one evening in my office, looking through the deed documents. "Just making sure everything's in order," she said, closing the file drawer quickly. The morning of the celebration, I witnessed her arguing with Thomas Lehman, my oldest friend and our farm manager for 25 years. Their voices carried across the sorting barn. "He doesn't need to know yet," Caroline insisted. Thomas looked troubled but nodded reluctantly. I should have confronted them both right then, but decades of burying emotions, a trait passed down from Elmer Hargrove's stern parenting, kept me silent. Instead, I retreated to my special spot among the oldest trees, where 5 Honeycrisp giants planted by my grandfather still produced the sweetest fruit in Michigan. By evening, the farmhouse glowed with autumn decorations, gourds, corn husks, and prize apples arranged in harvest baskets. Caroline had hired local favorite Maple Creek Catering, known for their apple-infused dishes. The centerpiece was a glazed ham with our own cider reduction, Ellen's recipe. Seeing it, I felt a pang of sadness that my wife never got to witness Caroline's apparent embrace of our family traditions. Conversations flowed along with our award-winning hard cider. I noticed Caroline working the room methodically, spending extra time with the Midwest Heritage representatives. At one point, I overheard phrases like transition timeline and ownership transfer, but convinced myself it was innocent agricultural shop talk. The tension began building when Caroline clinked her glass for attention. "Before we serve dessert, I'd like to make a special presentation to my father." The room quieted as she brought out a small wooden box carved with apple blossoms, a gift I'd given Ellen on our first anniversary. "Dad, your life's work has been these orchards," Caroline began, her voice carrying that professional tone she'd developed since taking over more of the business operations. 3 generations of Hargroves have nurtured this land, but all things eventually need new caretakers. The room's atmosphere shifted. Neighbors exchanged glances. Thomas stared at his plate. "Which is why," Caroline continued, "I've spent the past year developing a transition plan for Hargrove Orchards. Midwest Heritage has offered an extraordinary opportunity that will preserve our legacy while adapting to modern agricultural realities." My heart hammered against my ribs. "What transition plan?" Caroline's smile didn't reach her eyes. "The paperwork is already processed, Dad. Remember when you were in the hospital for your heart? The power of attorney you signed gave me authority to make business decisions, and this was the right one. You sold my orchards? The words came out as a whisper. Our orchards, she corrected, and not sold, strategically partnered with preservation easements and profit-sharing arrangements. You'll retain a consultant position and, without asking me, I stood up so quickly my chair crashed backward. This land isn't just property, Caroline. It's a business, she cut in sharply, a business you've been running into the ground for years. The room fell deadly silent. Even the representatives from Midwest Heritage looked uncomfortable. What are you talking about? I demanded. Caroline pulled out a folder. Tax liens, second mortgages, declining production numbers. Did you think I wouldn't find out about your gambling? The cash withdrawals every month? The credit cards Mother never knew about? Her voice cracked slightly, the only hint that the businesswoman exterior was hiding my daughter somewhere inside. Thomas finally spoke up. Caroline, maybe this isn't the time or place. No, Thomas, she interrupted. Dad chose this time and place years ago when he decided his addiction was more important than our future. The room began to spin. My deepest secret, the gambling that had nearly cost us everything, was now being announced to everyone who mattered in my life. Neighbors who'd respected the Hargrove name for generations. Business partners who'd trusted my handshake for decades. And my daughter, who now looked at me with a mixture of disgust and pity that cut deeper than any humiliation my father had ever inflicted. The room froze in that terrible silence, the kind that falls when a family's dirty laundry is suddenly hung out for everyone to see. My neighbors, people I'd shared equipment with during tough harvests, couldn't meet my eyes. The Midwest Heritage executives exchanged knowing glances, and I realized with sickening clarity that my weakness had become a business opportunity for them. $8 million, Caroline continued, her voice hardening. That's what our heritage was worth. The land Grandpa bought for pennies during the Depression is now prime real estate. But do you know what your gambling debts totaled over the last decade? She slid a paper across the table. Almost $2 million, nearly a quarter of our family legacy, lost to blackjack tables in Traverse City. My hands trembled as I reached for my water glass. You had no right, I managed to say, though my voice sounded foreign even to me. I had every right, Caroline shot back. Mom begged you to get help for years. Her stroke happened the night she found those casino receipts in your truck. Did you know that? The stress of realizing you'd been lying all those years triggered it. That revelation hit me like a physical blow. Ellen's stroke had always seemed so sudden, so random. The idea that my deception might have caused it was unbearable. Before I could respond, Caroline reached into her bag and pulled out a small object, tossing it onto my plate with a dull thud. A half-eaten apple core, brown and oxidizing. "That's your share," she said, voice ice cold. "After what you did to Mom, you're lucky to get anything." Something snapped inside me. Maybe it was the public humiliation, so reminiscent of kneeling on those bruised apples under my father's stern gaze. Maybe it was hearing Ellen's stroke connected to my failings. Or maybe it was simply seeing 50 years of work reduced to a discarded apple core. "You think you know everything?" I stood up slowly, my voice low but steady. "You think you understand what this land means? What I've sacrificed?" "Dad," Caroline started, but I cut her off. "No, you've had your say. Now these good people are going to hear the whole truth." I turned to face our guests, these witnesses to my disgrace. My daughter is right about one thing. I've been gambling. But she's wrong about why. I walked to the old cherrywood cabinet where we kept important documents and pulled out a weathered folder I'd hidden behind family photo albums. "This land has a secret, one I've kept for 30 years. The room grew impossibly quieter as I spread out soil test reports from 1994, documents I'd commissioned privately after several workers developed unusual illnesses. The northwestern quadrant, Ellen's Arbor, sits on contaminated soil. The previous owner, before my father bought adjacent land, operated an unregulated chemical dump for agricultural pesticides in the 1930s. I handed the most recent report to Thomas. Arsenic levels 10 times acceptable limits. Heavy metals. Compounds they don't even have names for. Caroline's face drained of color. That's impossible. We're certified organic. In most sections, yes. But I fenced off the worst areas, claimed it was for experimental varieties. The cleanup estimates were in the millions, money we never had. The gambling, my voice faltered. It started as a desperate attempt to win enough for remediation without bankrupting us. I couldn't bear selling the land and passing this poison to another family. The Midwest Heritage representatives were already on their phones, stepping outside for urgent conversations. Caroline stared at the documents, fingers trembling as she turned pages of technical reports I'd hidden for decades. Ellen knew, I continued, my voice breaking. Not about the gambling, that came later, but she knew about the contamination. That's why she wanted to sell portions for development. She was trying to distance us from liability. The stress of keeping that secret together, that's what really hurt her health over time. I looked directly at my daughter, seeing the child I loved beneath the businesswoman facade. I named that section Ellen's Arbor, not as a romantic gesture, but as a warning to myself. Every day I saw that sign, I remembered the price of my silence. Thomas stood up, his weathered farmer's face grave. Jim, if these reports are accurate, Midwest Heritage can void this entire transaction for failure to disclose. Caroline looked up from the documents, her professional demeanor shattered. You let me sell poisoned land? Do you have any idea what this does to me legally, to my reputation? The room erupted in murmurs and concerned conversations. I walked past Caroline, past Thomas, past neighbors whose opinions had shaped my self-worth for decades. At the doorway, I turned back once. The land was never just about money to me. It was about protecting everyone, including you, Caroline. I failed. But at least now you know why. I walked out into the orchard, the autumn air crisp against my face, leaving behind the chaos of revelation and the daughter who now had to face the true cost of our family legacy. The fallout was immediate and devastating. By morning, Midwest Heritage's lawyers had already filed to rescind the purchase agreement, citing fraudulent withholding of material information. Caroline faced potential personal liability since she'd signed documents attesting to the orchard's compliance with environmental regulations. The contamination wasn't just a family secret anymore, it was a legal nightmare. I spent that night in the caretaker's cabin at the edge of the property, a small structure my grandfather had built during those early Depression years. The next day, Thomas found me there, bringing coffee and a hard truth. The county's been notified. Environmental inspectors are coming tomorrow. 3 days passed before Caroline came to find me. She stood in the doorway of the cabin, looking simultaneously older and younger. A professional whose certainties had crumbled. A daughter facing her father's complicated legacy. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked simply. "Would you have believed me?" I countered. "Or would you have thought it was another lie from a gambling addict trying to keep control?" She sat down heavily at the small table. "The deal's collapsed. Midwest Heritage is threatening to sue for due diligence costs. My reputation in the industry is—" She trailed off. "The banks are calling about the mortgage payments." "I'm sorry, Caroline, truly. I thought I was protecting you." "By hiding toxic land? By gambling away our security?" Her anger flared, then subsided.
But I should have seen something was wrong. Should have asked why you were so obsessed with keeping certain sections off limits. That conversation lasted hours, painful but necessary.
Caroline revealed that Ellen had indeed suspected my gambling, but had protected me until finding those receipts. Mom's last coherent words in the hospital weren't about loving you, Caroline admitted. They were, "Watch the money, your father can't help himself." The revelation stung, but it was fair. I'd failed my family in fundamental ways. The next weeks brought a parade of officials, environmental inspectors, county assessors, agricultural compliance officers. The contamination was confirmed, but found to be contained to roughly 30 acres, less than the 50 I'd feared. Modern testing methods showed the toxins hadn't leached into groundwater, sparing us the nightmare of downstream liability. Surprisingly, it was Thomas who found our path forward. His nephew worked for the EPA's Brownfield Redevelopment Program, which offered grants for remediating contaminated agricultural land. "It won't be quick," Thomas explained, "but there's federal money for exactly this situation. Former owners aren't personally liable if they cooperate fully." Caroline, ever the businesswoman, quickly pivoted to research. She discovered a pilot program at Michigan State University seeking test sites for bioremediation, using specific plants to extract heavy metals from soil. "They'll pay us to use our land as their laboratory," she explained, the first hint of hope in her voice since the revelation. An unexpected ally emerged in Betty Winters, our neighboring farmer who'd been unusually quiet during my birthday disaster. She approached us at the local diner, neutral territory, with a proposal. "My son's renewable energy company is looking for solar farm locations. Contaminated agricultural land is perfect, no food concerns, already cleared. They'll lease long-term while your remediation happens underneath." Gradually, a new vision for Hargrove orchards took shape. The clean sections would continue traditional apple production under Thomas's management. The contaminated northwest quadrant would become a dual-purpose solar and bioremediation site. The university partnership would bring scientific prestige, offsetting some of the reputational damage. The most difficult conversation came when Caroline and I had to face the family whose children had developed rare cancers after working summers at our orchard decades ago. The Parsons had never connected their daughter's lymphoma to our land, but they deserved to know. We sat in their living room, confessing our family's darkest secret. I expected rage, perhaps even threats of lawsuits. Instead, Mr. Parsons simply asked, "Are you fixing it now?" When we outlined our remediation plans, Mrs. Parsons nodded slowly. Sarah would have approved. She was studying environmental science before she got sick. That conversation led to an unexpected partnership. The Parsons family became advocates for our transparency, helping us establish a healthcare monitoring fund for former workers. Their forgiveness was a gift I hadn't dared hope for. 6 months after my disastrous birthday dinner, Caroline and I stood together in the orchard, watching workers install the first solar panels. She'd taken a leave of absence from her consulting job to oversee our transformation, moving back into the farmhouse. "I found your recovery chips," she said quietly, "in the desk drawer. 3 years sober?" I nodded. "After Ellen's stroke. Too late to save her trust, but I had to try." "Why didn't you tell me about that either?" "Shame," I admitted, "and I didn't think I deserved forgiveness yet." The unexpected twist came last week. While clearing out old storage for the university research team, Caroline found my father's original deed to the property, along with letters from the previous owner warning about the unusable northwest section. My father had known about the contamination all along. His strict prohibition against playing in that area wasn't just discipline, it was protection. The burden I'd carried alone for decades had actually been passed down, father to son. Caroline handed me those yellowed letters with tears in her eyes. Grandpa was trying to protect you, just like you tried to protect me. We Hargroves aren't very good at saying things directly, are we? For the first time in months, we laughed together. Standing here today, watching the sunrise over our transformed orchard, I'm struck by how differently things turned out from what I'd feared. The clean sections are thriving under Caroline's modernized management. She's introduced heirloom varieties that command premium prices at farmers markets across the state. The solar farm generates enough revenue to fund our ongoing remediation efforts. The university researchers tell us the soil in the contaminated section is already showing improvement. We named the solar field Ellen's Light, a better tribute than that cursed apple arbor ever was. I think she would have approved of how her daughter and I finally learned to speak honest truths to each other, even when they hurt. Family legacies are complicated things. They're not just about what we inherit, but what we choose to pass on. I inherited land, determination, and secrets. Caroline inherited my stubbornness and her mother's clear-eyed business sense. Together, we're creating something new, a family business built on transparency rather than silence. If you're carrying a family secret that's becoming too heavy, consider setting it down. The truth can burn like frost, but it can also clear the ground for new growth. I nearly lost everything trying to handle it alone. If you found value in my story, please subscribe to hear more family business journeys like mine. And remember, sometimes what looks like the end of your legacy might actually be its redemption. Thanks for listening.